Play-Doh. Can you conjure up the salty smell of it just by seeing this yellow canister? Early on in my career, I was a grief therapist in schools. I loved using Play-Doh to have kids molded into something that expressed how they were feeling. Kids are naturally expressive and comfortable getting messy in the process. I remember one kid took the Play-Doh and broke it into 2 pieces to illustrate his broken home. Yeah. Another kid took the Play-Doh and made it into a giant tidal wave to illustrate how her grief would knock her down. Did anyone warn you? My topic's a little heavy. Just breathe. Another kid took the Play-Doh and threw it against the wall. He was expressing how he felt about his father being incarcerated. And then the bell would ring, and they would clean up their mess and go back to class. Nice catch. Parents would sometimes say to me that they didn't believe that their child was grieving and coping with this loss. When I asked them why they felt that, they said, well, one minute my son is crying, and the next minute he's playing and seems perfectly fine. But you see, children have a natural built-in defense mechanism that protects them against tough emotions. They oscillate between actively grieving and playing. Adults tend to lose this natural rhythm during hardship. We tend to bypass these so-called negative emotions with suppression and control. And this is reinforced in our mainstream culture by giving accolades to orderly and linear thinking and the quickest to get back to work. And the well-known 5 stages of grief model is presented in this similar neat and tidy package. But this is problematic for those dealing with chronic and messy grief because grief has different operating instructions. And so, in a secretive and sometimes shameful way, we bury our unresolved feelings associated with loss. During my graduate research, I learned of Pauline Boss's work. She gave a name to the experience of living with chronic grief due to unresolved situations. She coined the term ambiguous loss. Immediately, this resonated with me. She broadens the current and limited perception that narrowly defines loss as death. She calls this ambiguous because a person has both changed and remains the same on some level. Behind me are a list of some of the ambiguous losses that people live with, and they impact both the person and the loved one, all their loved ones. But even still, society doesn't acknowledge these as losses, right? We can't get a greeting card that says, "I'm sorry to hear of your son's neurological condition," or your mother's dementia. And so, since we don't make space in our lives to acknowledge these losses, we don't grieve them. And society lacks helpful rituals like funerals for those that are dealing with these tough circumstances. Yeah. And since we don't acknowledge them, if you or a loved one is experiencing one of these, an aspect of your life may appear frozen or stuck because there's no end, no conclusion, and no resolve. So grieving may appear pointless, kind of like the phrase, "What's the point in crying about it if it won't change anything?" Well, I beg to differ. Unprocessed grief can lead to a whole host of physical illnesses and conditions. High blood pressure, heart disease, chronic illnesses, cancer. And psychologically, when we don't process our grief, it can lead to anger. Anger can turn to rage. Rage can turn to violence, like homicide or suicide. This type of suppression reminds me of a game, whack-a-mole. Yeah, you know the one I'm talking about, where you have the hammer, and your job is to smash that mole back into its hole as fast as you can. We smash our emotional moles in many different ways. By staying overly busy at work, numbing our feelings with substances, gambling, overeating, binge-watching shows, Game of Thrones, right? Gambling and shopping, sex, on and on. Over the years of suppressing these emotions causes them to get bigger and more unmanageable. So why is our natural reflex to smash any perceived negative emotion rather than to feel it? And why do we continue to choose a maladaptive behavior we know that will cause us greater harm in the long run? You see, the funny thing about grief is it will patiently wait for you to unpack it. Now, understanding how to grieve has been my life's work. Most of us would rather run, numb, or hide our feelings associated with loss. When I was in my mid-20s, I was a wilderness guide in the Boundary Waters canoe area of northern Minnesota. My job was to lead adolescents on canoe trips and teach them about surviving in the wilderness. One of the groups assigned to me was from an impoverished urban school. These were tough kids with thick skins, and many of them had never left their neighborhoods before. One of these young men, we'll call him Tim, was visibly agitated one night after dinner. He said to the group that he'd do anything to get high right now. With that, another student picked up a frog and said, "I heard you could get high by licking a frog." True story. Tim lunged so fast at that innocent creature. I stood back in utter disbelief, witnessing this young man attempting to get high by licking a frog. But then it occurred to me that perhaps nobody in his life had ever modeled anything other than to pull the emergency handle on tough emotions, and that perhaps being emotionally vulnerable came with a high price. So after failing to get high, surprise, we sat down by the lake, and I provided a safe space to just listen to him vent. He wept about the layers of uncertainty and the ambiguous losses he lived with on a daily basis. He told me about how his mother abandoned him at a young age and how his father beat him. He had, at that moment, what I have now therapeutically named his first official pity party. Yeah, pity party. Now, pity parties get a bad rap. We think of someone sulking and feeling sorry for themselves, but I would like to reframe this in the context of unseen ambiguous losses. We need to acknowledge these difficult, complex emotions, and by that I don't mean dwelling on woe is me and eating a gallon of ice cream, but to rather acknowledge these circumstances that we're living with. Otherwise, if we don't process these unresolved feelings, we may spend the rest of our lives licking that metaphorical frog. Okay, true confession time. I haven't licked a frog per se. I may be guilty of kissing a few toads. My husband excluded, of course. But when adversity in the form of a chronic illness slapped me in the face, I was no better off than Tim. I was given the diagnosis of Crohn's disease at the age of 20, and it felt like a grenade went off in my life. Crohn's disease, for those of you unfamiliar with it, is an incurable autoimmune disease that wreaks havoc in your entire intestinal tract. It seemed like my body was broken. I remember it felt like I was saying, "Stop, can't you see I'm broken?" But the thing was, on the outside, you couldn't tell I was suffering. I was living with an ambiguous loss because nobody acknowledged this as something that required grieving. It seemed easier for everybody to just pretend that I was fine. but the disease consumed me, physically, mentally, and emotionally. It took all my energy to keep that emotional mole in its hole. But naturally, it would pop up in unexpected places. I tried escaping it, but grief has a funny way of finding you, no matter where you go, even if it's a remote island in Southeast Alaska. As an active member of this quaint community, I got to participate in the powerful Alaskan Native ceremonies around the cycle of life. These dances reenacted their stories of suffering and the grief and joy of their people. I remember the sounds of the beating drum pounding in my heart, the smells of the burning sage drew me in. Their dancing made me joyful, and their stories made me weep. I found a place where I could give up my armor and experience my body as whole again. In this community, I found the opportunity to dance this grief oscillation, and I was accepted for being imperfect. I was reminded that even with this disease, I'm okay. Now, fortunately for you, you don't need to move to a remote island in order to work through your ambiguous loss. You will need to practice a few key rituals in order to embrace the ambiguity that you or a loved one's living with. But first, I think it's really important for us to acknowledge what our society says and undo this belief that we need to squash or ignore painful emotions. So if you decide that you want to go ahead and practice embracing ambiguity, I'm going to give you a few tips. First, get into the practice of naming your losses as they happen. Voice these heartbreaking experiences and stop minimizing them. Me, I'm a classic minimizer. I tend to measure and compare my story to others, and then convince myself that someone somewhere else has it worse off than me. Comparison doesn't motivate, even if it's true. It just adds more distance between you and your actual experience. Others, you're frog lickers. You know who you are. Please ask for help. So once you get into the habit of naming your losses, you're ready to have a party, a productive pity party. Set it up by first deciding how much time you're going to need to vent, and then find a trusted loved one to just simply listen to you vent. Now, tell that trusted listener to just listen. They're going to want to fix it or put a silver lining around it. And I get that this is easier said than done, especially for you type A's out there. You're going to want to fix it, but you can't. Yeah, and once you get into the habit of naming your losses and having your pity party, you may need to ask for more time, especially if you're dealing with acute grief. You'll need more time. This is a type of ritual that I found necessary for myself. And if you are someone who fears burdening others, which was my fear for years, find a trained therapist or a support group to help you. And remember those children playing with the Play-Doh? Yeah, they got into their messy emotions. They cleaned it up and went on with their day. We have to practice this dance, much like our children naturally do. Maybe 12 minutes ago, you had never heard of a definition for ambiguous loss, though I guarantee you, you or a loved one is living with it. So I hope now that you can lean into your experience of it and own it, because the truth of the matter is, life is filled with ambiguity. And my hope is that you can dance, sing, laugh, and play, not just when life is good, but when you need it the most. Namaste.